Okay. Hello, everybody. Hello. Welcome to this week's episode of Goddess Matters here on Journey to the Goddess TV. Goddess Matters is the weekly series that I host with my hostess, co-hostess of the mostest. There we go,
Ah,
Dr. Andrea Slominski.
good morning, Dr. H squared. Here we are again.
Here we are. And we're bringing back for round two Dr. Emma Woods. Hello, Dr. Emma.
Good morning.
Good morning. Well, that's funny. Actually, we're pre-recording this. It's the afternoon for us, morning for her because she's in Australia. She's coming to us from down under. And so today we're actually going to be talking about Dr. Emma's book based on her doctoral thesis. It's on the vagina dentata, which she has informed me we could also call the toothed vagina, for those of you that might not know what dentata means. For a fuller bio of Emma and her work and how you can reach out to her, follow her, etc., go to the YouTube text box. Everything's in there. Andrea, do you have anything else you'd like to say?
No, just good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to be here again with you, Emma, and so grateful that you are willing to rearrange your schedule and come to us from all the way around the world and talk about this important book and your important work. Here's the actual book called Bite Me, which you can get
Thank
on
you.
Amazon. And this conversation couldn't be more timely. It couldn't be more timely.
Agreed. Agreed. And so, last minute housekeeping notes before we jump in. Sorry, I forgot to say this earlier. Please like this video, leave a comment. At least myself, I'll be in the live chat. I think one of us will be in the live chat at least when this is airing, premiering on YouTube. Subscribe to the channel, all that jazz. And yeah, Andre, why don't you start us off with the questioning?
Okay, awesome. So Emma, I was being a feminist and kind of aware of all things patriarchal, I was so surprised about how much I learned reading through the work that you've basically distilled from your dissertation. And I can't believe how timely it is to be talking about this mythological this myth theme that's existed for so many thousands of years, right alongside of patriarchy, and to be talking about it this week when we are in the midst of the revelation of the 62 million website views of men trading tips on how to drug and assault and rape their wives. I think that this is on top of the Epstein files, on top of everything else that's going on in culture, and all of the worldwide issues, especially that you bring up in the book. I'm just really excited to be talking to you, and it just couldn't be more relevant to what's happening in the zeitgeist. Do you feel that your work is really now sort of, wow, this is it?
Well, thanks, Andrea. It was a kind of interesting journey to get to this, and it was really when I started, I kind of just kept finding this idea of the tooth vagina cropping up everywhere. Um, but I think it was when I actually was reading The Raw and the Cook by Levi Strauss, and he was telling a tale, and he just had this little side note that sort of said, "Oh, when the woman had teeth in her vagina, but that's not really important to this story, or not something that we're going to explore." And I thought, it's really weird that no one has explored this because it really was everywhere. I found it in mythologies from like all over the globe and important mythologies. So, if you look at the tale of Maui, who we all saw kind of dancing across the screens in Moana, and
Yeah.
it was in the zeitgeist. He was actually killed by a vagina dentata, and that's sort of one of those stories that doesn't get told, and it's one of the most important stories in probably his journey because it was actually how death was introduced to the world. So,
Yeah.
he decided that he would go and climb back into the vagina of the underworld goddess, who kind of was the portal between life and death. And as he was sort of climbing through, all the birds in the forest started kind of laughing at this image of this man crawling back into a vagina. And she kind of woke up and just her reflexes just sort of snapped her vagina shut, and he was cut in two. Um, and so you see these stories everywhere. Like I found them pretty much on every continent around the world, but they never really get talked about. But interesting because they are still so common. Like you still see today, like, Alien and Predator. If you go back and have a look at those, they were based on this idea of this toothed vagina. Um, even in sort of mainstream shows like where you wouldn't expect to find it, like I found them talking about it in Glee, which was
Hmm.
very mainstream and very aimed at teens. It was in Orange is the New Black, so these big shows, and it's still kind of talked about, but it's never really been studied as a whole. Like there's a few papers and things, but not sort of a comprehensive study of it.
Yeah, absolutely. But looking at what you've written in the comprehensive study and how you bring it forward and how these mythologies and these mythic images and myth themes have really been founded in the fear of female sexual power, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, and I
And
think that's where it is, that kind of just that dangerous sexual woman. Like she's going to devour you. I mean, you've got that devouring mother archetype,
mhm.
which we see so often. You've got this sexually dangerous woman, and it kind of bridges the two together.
Yeah, and the whole concept of that the independent, sexually liberated woman who has sovereignty over her body and her desires um, is is dangerous and is potentially castrating and has to have those powers removed in the sense of what you're talking about, of the teeth removed from the vagina, or the sexual power tamed, or and even the tales that you talk about of different powers actually inhabiting the vagina, like like the eels and the snakes and these kinds of things, right? These different threats that we would consider dangerous from nature. And so the whole idea of that this sovereign independent woman who wants to be in control of her life, make her own decisions, live the way she wants to live, has to be broken and tamed and brought to heel and brought back, as in Project 2025, into the home, no vote, no education, a baby machine that, and we've really, the full circle nature of these struggles is really quite remarkable.
Yeah, and thank you for that, because I think that's really what I was trying to get across. Because when I went back and looked at the scholarship that had been done previously, it really was this male centric interpretation, right? It was all done by males, it was all about the male experience of these stories. Um, and so we kind of saw these stories as, the arc that they'd sort of pulled out of these was that this woman has teeth in her vagina, and then you have this male hero that comes along and removes the teeth, and then everyone lives happily ever after. So there were these sort of like almost like fairy tale arcs.
Yeah.
And they certainly aren't that. And so that's what I was really interested in, is when you go back and read them. And I might just read a quick one here, just kind of to kind of demonstrate that. So this one was out of Veria Elwin's study through central India, and he collected 42 different myths from the area. So one of these tales was, there was a Baiga girl who looked so fierce and angry, as if there was magic in her, that for all her beauty no one dared marry her. But she was full of passion and longed for men. She had many lovers, but though she did not know it, she had 3 teeth in her vagina. And whenever she went to a man, she cut his penis into 3 pieces. So you can kind of see that fairy tale kind of element there. Um, so after a time, she grew so beautiful that the landlord of the village determined to marry her on the condition that she allowed 4 of his servants to have intercourse with her first. To this she agreed, and the landlord first sent in a Brahmin to her, and he lost his penis. Then he sent in a Gund, but the Gund said, I am only a poor man, and I am too shy to do this while you are looking at me. So he covered the girl's face with a cloth, and 2 other servants, a Bhaga and a Nagara, crept quietly into the room. The Gund held the girl down, and the Bhaga thrust his flint into her vagina and knocked out 1 of the teeth. The Agera inserted his tongue and pulled out the other 2. The girl wept with pain, but she was immediately consoled when the landlord came in and said that he would now marry her immediately. So the interpretations of these stories by these men really left out this idea of the pain. And you can kind of see this like drawing the magic out of her. So, they're completely disempowering this woman to make her suitable for marriage. Um, and that's what I was really seeing through a lot of these stories was that was what the actual arc is. So you would have this woman who quite often didn't even know she had teeth in her vagina. Um, and they were often discovered through non-consensual or forced intercourse. And then you had this male element that would break the teeth, but it was often violent and it was often sticks or sharpened stones or,
Yeah.
it was always this pain for the woman. And the pain was often quite graphic and was sort of the meat of the story. And then this idea that now that she's been subdued, she's suddenly suitable for intercourse, marriage, procreation, all these things. And
Well, and
I
there's,
found it quite,
yeah, I was
yeah.
going to say, and there's no part of these tales that the woman has no agency. There's no consent. There's no agreement. There's
Mhm.
no there's no expression in these tales of the woman's experience at all of,
No.
of these processes that are done to her, right? In order
Hmm.
to tame her. It's quite it's really the fact that the woman's experience is never considered really slams the lid of patriarchy down on these tales.
I mean, I think
Absolutely.
that was pretty much for me our whole entire experience, or my entire experience of studying mythology at Pacifica, tradition after tradition after tradition, was almost by and large that women's experiences were not accounted for, or their desires were not accounted for, and it was all told either from the male perspective or toward the male perspective. Um, but I want to make sure that we have explained to the audience clearly, like what the vagina dentata actually is. I know you just read a story, but are there other
Mhm.
kind of specific mythic tropes or patterns within that archetype that they should be aware of?
So there's so I actually decided, and people told me I would not be able to do this when I did it, but I was like, I am only going to focus on literal interpretation. So there is a vagina and there's teeth. Um, but there's so much other archetypal imagery that you see. So you see all these sort of, you know, the probably the most prominent one is this idea of a cave with its stalactites and stalagmites, of sort of this gaping earth womb with teeth. So there is sort of that idea of it in other places, which is not quite so literal. Um, but I honestly just ran out of room to even start going down those paths because
Mhm.
it is everywhere.
It was shocking. It was shocking to see how prevalent it was across cultures. And I was shocked because I never came across that or don't remember coming across it. And what I came across was more the menstrual stuff because my work dovetails a little bit with yours because it's the fear of menstrual
Hmm.
danger as a way to, control and disempower women. So some similar conclusions. And I love that you brought in the menstrual piece as well in the Wandering Womb. I thought that was a really interesting tie-in. Um, so so yeah, so sorry, I just lost. I'm having my perimenopause moment.
Having a perimenopause moment. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think just to kind of sum it up for people who are listening, the whole myth model or myth theme is of the woman who has sharp, deadly, dangerous set of teeth or some sort of weapon, or her vagina is possessed by some kind of a creature that castrates men when they penetrate her and have sex with her, whether it's consensual or not. And usually in the tales, consent has really nothing to do with it. So the idea of the vagina dentata, as I understand it, Emma, is that it's this whole idea of the vagina with teeth that is the danger, right? That's the danger of the sexual power.
Correct, and it's this idea that you know that men need to tame this power, right? They need to disempower it. They need to defang it. They need to make this sort of safe vessel for them to have sex with. And it's interesting because I looked at some of the interpretations in, like Stith Thompson, who was, created the motif index of folk literature, and is still used today. His interpretation of it, and it is in the index, is that it's a woman that kills her husbands with her toothed vagina. And so it's this really active sort of femme fatale woman that's going after these men, whereas it's really not that at all. Because quite often, as you noted, the women in these stories don't even want to have sex with these men. They're being held down, and then it's discovered that they have this vagina dentata, and then they're sort of it's beaten out of them. Um, but it's kind of this active language that they use that this woman kills them, whereas quite often the men aren't killed, and quite often their penis gets restored magically at the end anyway. Um,
The other
um,
thought I had when I was reading your book, as I was like, is this like a projection of because a lot of times women have pain the first couple of times they have sex,
mhm,
and or if you haven't had it for a long time. So I was like, is this some weird projection of like men feeling bad about causing women pain during first intercourse, and then all of a sudden it's like projected, like the woman is the one causing men's pain? Because we don't hear anything about her pain, as we've already noted during the sexual
mhm.
encounter from the violation and from the first intercourse. So I was really, because like I was like, is that what this is? Like a reversal for men to assuage their like guilt that they feel for causing the woman physical pain?
I think there's that idea of that, they're braving this danger of the woman. It's also that projection of um, this idea that when a male enters a woman, he's this hard, strong, virile penis, and he comes out soft and flaccid. Um, so, of this projection of, I guess, victory, whereas the physicality of it is sort of defeat, right? Um, it's also that idea of feeding, the vagina feeding off the man and feeding off his semen, um, which you see in other places. But I think that's part of it is it's kind of that phallic representation of something that can't be broken. And that's why they quite often using that external force of the stick or the um, to create a non-dangerous vagina. So, maybe they get to emerge victorious this time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I think that yeah, that I have something I hadn't thought of until I read your book. Obviously, I came to understand it through writing your book, is that idea of them of the virile, strong, solid penis and then coming out shriveled and spent and kind of weak, incapacitated, really. And it seemed like really obvious to me, like men's weakness in in the presence of or weak their sexual desire for women is so strong that it can't be controlled or tamed, so they have to project that onto women to control and tame
Mm-hmm.
them. Like that was kind of my first thought going in, but then you brought up all these other interesting theories and ways of, I mean, obviously you brought in the penis envy conversation, or um God, that quote, the quote that you gave from Joseph Campbell, the famous mythologist that all obviously we all know well, but the world loves, and his justification in some of those myths um, for the defanging of the young women as a means to own them, control them, to marry them. Or make them into woman, because that's when they become, right? You go from like wild child to domesticated woman. I was really shocked to see that quote from Joseph Campbell.
Yeah. And I think there's also that idea of quite often the vagina is separated from the woman in these stories, like it's treated as a separate entity. And so, you know, even when they're beating it and destroying it, it's not treated as the woman. So it's kind of that separation that justifies it. Um, that women and their sexuality are separated. So that's how she can be redeemed to be a virtuous woman afterwards is, this is a separate entity that is controlled separately. And once they tame it and beat it to submission, then this woman is redeemed through this.
Hmm.
Um, and that is horrifying.
Yeah, that issue of redemption is really interesting. Yeah, especially like because I think of it solely in terms of Christianity, but like I'm in my mind like trying to apply it right now to some of the other stories that you describe and just wondering like how that I don't know, I'm just considering like what that means in terms of these other cultures that are live outside the Christian mythos. This idea
Well,
of
yeah, I
male and
just
female.
the thing that I saw, which I was disturbing, but I thought you brought out really well in the book, is the is the mythological progression from the vagina dentata into female genital mutilation, right?
Hmm.
As a form of control over women and all of the different things that are done culturally worldwide and which again relate to believing that if a woman had too much pleasure in the sexuality of her body that she would naturally be wanton and go looking for other partners than her husband and she would be unfaithful. So in order to do that, they have to do the female genital mutilation, the removal of the clitoris, sometimes the labia minora. I mean, these incredibly awful things that are done, and because to even have sexual gratification for women is dangerous.
Hmm.
I
Yeah,
mean,
and it was fascinating because you hear about female genital mutilation, and you don't quite often hear the cultural stories behind why. And so, when you consider, like, I mean, I think the latest UNICEF stats were that you had 200 million girls and women across 30 countries have been subjected to this practice currently. Um, this idea that in some of them it's being removed because it's this idea that the clitoris is this vestigial tooth left over from when women
mhm,
had teeth in their vaginas, or in other cultures it's a dart that will puncture the man while he's having sexual intercourse with her, or there's another one where it was considered like a leech that would latch onto them and suck their life force. And so it's really kind of horrifying that that's the justification when you go back and look at the mythological basis for these things still happening, and the impact that they have. Um, but in reality, it was just a way to try and control women. And it's not just these countries. I mean, you still had in the sort of 19th century. I mean, any woman that was sexually promiscuous would have quite often have a clitoridectomy, because that would stop her from being, this woman that would want sexual pleasure. And there were some doctors that were using this as a cure-all for anything, like hysteria, which we all know women were just constantly diagnosed with. Um, one of the things they do with that was cut the clitoris off,
Right.
yeah.
You
which is
know,
horrifying.
I met a woman once on an airplane who was looking at diagrams of vaginas. So I was all curious and I was like, what are you doing? And so she is, or was, let's just say she works in immigrant communities in the Bronx, helping to restore vaginas that have been subjected to FGM. Um, and so, like, restoring to the best that she can. And she described to me some of the complications in that community, um, in that a lot of times it's actually the mothers that want their daughters to go through this with this procedure. I think that's like the most heartbreaking thing from our perspective, probably. Um, and describing sometimes how the men are actually trying to prevent it from happening, like maybe the male who have become male doctors. But she said one of the arguments the women will give to me is that, how can you Westerners come and tell us what is okay to do with our, children for religious reasons when you have your own adult women and sometimes teenage girls going in for elective labia surgery. So there's different reasons, right? Sometimes you just need reconstruction because you've had an accident. But for a while, it was like the hot thing to get a labioplasty because porn, the word that can get us like the algorithm going down, but it's important to say. There's this idea of the ideal vagina. And
Mhm.
again, I think as we're talking right now, I just realized that the cutting of the labia of a teenage girl is its own kind of vestige of this vagina dentata to control the woman by what her vagina looks like, maybe to control her pleasure, to tame her. And yeah, so yeah, kind of taking it full circle to that vagina dentata just through our conversation right now.
Yeah, that's a fascinating insight. I hadn't really connected that to, but you do have that. I mean, labioplasty is not an uncommon surgery these days, and it's done for aesthetic reasons, but it kind of is still this creating yourself to be perfect for a male.
Right. And it's so interesting because just recently, um, medical science came out with the complete mapping of the entire nerve system of the clitoris,
Right.
right? That was just released recently, and how broad and expansive and how much longer the neurons are into the pelvis and into the labia and the vagina and all the different parts of women's genitalia, that it's much more complex and much larger and much more expansive, the neural network, than they originally thought, which is now leading women to, some women and some doctors, obviously, some female, I guess you would call it feminist, gynecologists, right? Saying, let's look at, like, what are we actually talking about here when we're talking about doing some kind or any kind of gynecological surgery, and how are we going to be impacting their lives, their sexual response, their pleasure, based on this new information.
Totally. Yeah, so you know, okay. I really want us to get on to some of the other things like the anti-rape devices and stuff, but I cannot get this out of my head. And you bring this up in your book about this in the pop culture movies like what's that? Teeth? Is that the name of that film?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can obviously describe it much better than me, but the fact that this male director who is fascinated with the subjects makes this film writing about a woman, describes like this condition, this vagina dentata condition she has, in all these non-consensual situations, like trying to help her reclaim her power in a way that actually creates just reiterates the problem, reinforces the problem rather than actually frees us. I don't know if you have more to
Yeah,
say about that.
and it is an interesting film because it's kind of touted as this feminist film, and it's kind of got that kind of rape revenge kind of idea in it. But if a woman was going to have a superpower to, take down men, it's this idea that you have to do it through having intercourse with these men. And it's not really something that you would want to be doing, right? You wouldn't want to be that intimate with them to disempower them. So it kind of taps back into that kind of femme fatale, like that's how women would love to take down men. And it's just this kind of bizarre male fantasy fetish. Um, Whereas, when you watch the movie, this girl is just violated over and over. And, yes, she does get to the point that she reclaims her power and then, goes hunting men at the very end. Sorry, there's a spoiler there, but, it's not that empowering. And it was interesting that that film actually really ties it into the chastity movement, the American chastity movement as well, because I think that it does have that, patriarchal overtones. But the fact that, at the end she's become this killing machine that's hunting down sexually abusive men just doesn't sort of sit with, I think, most females' experience. And as I point out in my book as well, the other sort of, when you looked at some of the interviews that they did, they really shied away from the word rape in that in the movie to explain the experiences, and were calling her first experience with the boy as an unfortunate incident, where at the time she clearly didn't want to have sex with him, and as you see later in the film, the teeth only come out when it is non-consensual sex. So she could
Right.
have consensual sex if she wants to. Um, but it was kind of that interesting thing. And if you look at the director actually took it from Camille Paglia's kind of interpretation of the vagina dentata and this idea that sex can never be anything but an exchange of power, which I completely disagree with, and I think it's a very sort of sad take on intercourse to say that it's something that can never be anything but in that transformation of power. I think that says more about you as a person if you think about it that way than sexual intercourse. And it's a sad state when you get to that point. But I mean, the whole idea of sexual intercourse between humans and the way that we should be representing it is that it can be an act of love, right? It can be an act of enjoyment. It can be an act of love. It doesn't have to be a power dynamic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. Andre,
Yeah, it
did
makes
you?
me it makes me think of the when you talk about the femme fatale, I think about the different species, and I'm not sure if it's black widows or which spider it is that after she mates, she eats her mate, she kills her mate, right? Um, and that there are other. I remember I was listening. I can't remember which one it was, but I was watching one of the Our Oceans, kind of documentaries, and it was a particular species of fish or something like that, and that you know the um, the narrator was saying that the male had to be careful to impress her enough or whatever because if she got annoyed enough, she'd kill him, right?
Yeah.
And
Well,
so, go ahead.
sorry. I was just going to say it's interesting you bring that up because the praying mantis is another one,
Yeah.
and the vagina dentata kind of had this Renaissance period with the surrealist artist and was often put together with the praying mantis.
Yes. I went and looked at all the art images that you had listed in the book when I was reading it. And I was like, holy moly, right? You as an undergraduate art major, right? That was not, we didn't, go through art history looking at sexually suggestive imagery for what it had to say about culture that, you looked at the different stages and development of art and styles and expressions. But yeah, it was really interesting to see in that early 1920s surrealist, right, movement, that
There's
expressionist movement, how that was part of what was going on.
there's something that just kind of it's just occurring to me that, and it's really the fact I can only think of one story that you recalled in the book, and maybe I'm just misremembering, but that most of the women afflicted with this vagina dentata are young girls,
Mhm.
right? Oh, I guess that's part of the point of the vagina dentata. You have to pull out and I just keep coming back to our pedophilic culture. Yes, I said it. And the Epstein files, right? And this desire to prey on young girls and somehow, I don't know, deflowering them as a way of I'm not sure. Do you see
Yeah.
where I'm trying to
I,
go with this?
and maybe it is that sort of idea of, in a lot of cultures, girls aren't subject to the laws of women, right? They're allowed to be a little bit more unclothed. They're a little bit allowed to be a little bit more free until they kind of get forced into this mold of the perfect woman. So maybe you are right there. Like it's that disempowering of that freedom that some girls have that women don't.
Well, and in taking control of a young child like that and controlling their life and what they do and where they come and go and what their expression is and what their relationships are, like in this trafficking, right? You never allow them, you control them in that space and keep them in that space so that they don't mature into sovereign women.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And they depend on you,
Yeah.
and they get used to male dominion and control and male pleasure being normal.
Yeah.
and maybe female pain being normal as well.
Yeah.
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 Well, um, what about
It,
sorry, go ahead.
no, no, you go.
Well, there's a whole I would love to hear what you have to say about the anti-rape devices and rape more of I mean, we kind of talked about the rape revenge narratives, but let's go more into the pop culture or what's happening now.
Well, and it's and a lot of this isn't pop culture, right? So when you think about the rape revenge, we talked about teeth, but there's these real world ideas of it. So um vagina dentata again had a little bit of a heyday with the Vietnam War. And a lot of folklorists had collected these narratives coming back from the soldiers returning of the vagina dentata. Um, and it was this idea that the Viet Cong prostitutes would create booby traps in their vaginas to take down soldiers. So this idea that they were implanting razor blades inside themselves and things that really just aren't realistic, right? I mean, if you put a razor blade in your vagina and the man has sex with you, you're going to be very damaged as well. Um, but there was all these ideas, and it's horrifying when you talk to these men that were coming back because it wasn't stopping them from having sex with these prostitutes. It was that they would, put things inside the women first to check for booby traps. So it wasn't this deterrent, but and so you had this idea of these women that again were this femme fatale, like I'm gonna attack you through my vagina. Whereas there was plenty of weapons lying around, right? Um, but it sort of was this story, and so um, at some point in the 60s, there's kind of a little article about it, but it never kind of there's very hard to find information of it. Whereas women were trying, some of the feminist collectives were trying to figure out how to design this trap. So they were thinking about getting like making these sort of like wooden nets almost that they could put razor blades inside and things. And it was definitely talked about. I don't think there was ever any prototypes really made. But interestingly enough, there's actually a device called Rapex now, which is still at the prototype stage. It was last time I looked. I haven't looked at it for a couple of years, but it was basically a female condom. So it's inserted at the mouth of the vagina and then has sort of like a condom, but it sits inside the woman rather than on the man. And it was designed to be like shark teeth in that you can go in, but when you try to pull out, the barbs are sort of backwards facing and they will sort of latch onto the penis. And then the man would be tagged, right? So when they were looking for the man because it would only be used for sexual assault, that they would be able to find the man because this device would still be attached to his penis because it couldn't really be removed outside of surgical removal. There has been a prototype made. It's obviously a very murky legal place of whether this can be used. It's interesting in that then it kind of brings up all these other ideas, though, that, are women expected to use these? I mean, they're not sort of feasible because of vaginal hygiene. You don't want to have something, put one in every time you go out. Like, do you have to put it in before you go to work for the day? Like, wear it for 10 hours, obviously, you know. Um, but then it's also this idea that then women are to be blamed, right? Like if you were raped, then why weren't you wearing one? Were you asking for it? Was it really consensual and you changed your mind? Um, and I remember reading a lot of notes on message boards about this and just this idea that, women would use them to trap men. And, if you broke up with your boyfriend, you'd invite him over for post breakup sex and have one in. And these poor men would be victimized by this. And it was just horrible. So, it's still this idea that it doesn't matter what you're trying to do, it's always the women's fault, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
And the fact is that if there was no rape, if there was no assault, you wouldn't need the the contraption, whatever it is, right? So there has to be
Yeah.
the assault first, right? The unconsensual sex. And so it's it's like, well, if you have to wear one of these, then the only time it's going to work is when you are being raped. So it doesn't prevent rape, right?
Well, and that's 100% valid, right? It's this idea that, oh well, because you've got this in, that is it then really rape even? Like, because you stopped it, like where does rape occur? Is it just at, if it's just one penetration, does it really count kind of idea, right? Um, and so it's scary, but it also kind of, like, I can see that even if this did become a thing, which obviously I would not advocate for because of all the hygiene reasons that I stated before, but also it becomes that bigger idea of, well, what were you wearing, right? Well, why weren't you wearing one? It's your fault type thing. But it's just horrifying. But it's also this idea of then, as you saw with the Viet Cong prostitutes, if you're going to rape a woman, are you just going to insert an object first, right?
Hmm.
Um, and you already see that sort of idea is happening. Women are being raped by objects rather than actual men, but um, it just kind of will increase the level of violence. It's not going to do anything to help.
The
Yeah.
device itself will, yeah, right. And
Yeah.
again,
Yeah.
we're at the point where like women's experiences and concerns um, aren't actually being invalidated because the men and the men's experiences and the men's needs and the men's perspectives are kind of
Hmm.
um, prioritized here.
Yeah. And honestly, that one of the reasons I really wanted to take this as a topic was because it really taps into that idea of folklore, right? This is the sort of thing that's whispered about in locker rooms by young boys. It's such a juvenile fantasy. Um, we all logically know that women don't have teeth in her vagina, but you can see that idea of middle school boys that have been denied a sexual education telling these stories in the hallways, right? And it hasn't grown from that. Um, and one of the things that I always advocate for is sexual education. I think that a lot of these problems would be solved by just honest and transparent sexual education, um, and this idea of respect and this idea of women's sovereignty that is sort of taught about when you sort of talk about sex as something for both parties, right? Sex is not just something men do, but that still seems to be a narrative that is very common. It's what all men do and only bad girls do. Um, and so I think understanding that, reframing how we see sex and not seeing it as this thing we have to hide and be ashamed of would really reframe a lot of these stories and probably prevent a lot of this dysfunctional behavior.
Totally.
Yeah.
Do you think, could you ever imagine a scenario in which a woman or a woman-centered community or culture would come up with a vagina dentata mythology?
So there is, and so there's a few stories that kind of go the other way, and it's women leveraging men's fear of it to prevent intercourse. So um, there's a fabulous story from sort of what's kind of Russia now, of this young woman that is forced to marry this man that she does not want to have a part of, and so on her wedding night, she actually inserts a pike, so one of those toothy fish, into her vagina. Um, and so the man's like, "Oh no, I'll leave you alone," type thing, and she uses it to sort of avoid intercourse with her husband. Um, and it is sort of one of those kind of quite funny stories, because eventually the guy goes to his mother's like, "Why haven't you had children yet?" And he says, "Oh, well, I can't have sex with my wife. She's got these teeth in her vagina." And the mother's like, "You're so stupid. Like, that's not a thing." And he's like, "No, no, it is. Like, I've seen them." And so his mother's like, "Look," and she lifts her skirts and shows her son her vagina. And she's like, "Look, I don't have teeth." And his response is, "Yeah, but you're so old, they all fell out," which I think is hilarious. But you do see this idea of it being used as a deterrent, right? And it's never, that's one of the few where a woman actually inserts something. But um, quite often it's used to instill this fear. So it's that understanding that men are afraid of this. So then I can use that to leverage getting out of sex. And when I go back to Glee, what I was talking about at the start, where that's used in that is that the woman, the young girl, is talking about how, she pretends to be quite promiscuous to get men interested in her, but as soon as they try and have intercourse with her, she talks about how she's got these barbed teeth in her vagina, and suddenly that their desire goes away.
Interesting. Maybe that's the appropriate anti-rape device. Shouldn't be laughing about something that's so terrible, but I mean, it's like,
Well, it's hard, right? And I think you have to have some humor about it.
hmm
And part of the reason I wanted to talk about it through this lens is because I think it does pique men's interest. I have got some criticism through my book that it wasn't angry enough. But I didn't want to disenfranchise men reading it, right? I
totally.
tried to keep it very factual, um, and not so opinionated. Obviously, my title "Bite Me" suggests opposite, but it really is this idea of you can just reject these ideas, right? You
Mhm.
don't have to get angry about them. You don't have to argue about them because by disenfranchising people, you're very unlikely to change their mind.
Right.
But if you can get them to read it and present the facts and present an argument without that emotion, you're more likely to be able to change someone's mind.
Totally
Um,
agreed. Hmm
and I have had quite a few men read my book. I even managed to convince my lovely father to edit it for me. Um, but you know, it is about that education, and I think trying to get men's buy-in to understand the repercussions of these stories. And it's not so much about not telling them, but changing the understanding of the context of them, understanding why they exist.
hmm
Um, because I think if you start telling them with this understanding of these were propaganda mechanisms used to control women, to convince women that they needed to be subjugated and controlled. And I mean, we haven't even got into the idea of that procreation comes from this, right? And you see in a lot of these stories that men take the power of procreation through women through these stories, and it's about the man making the woman suitable to plant his seed in. Going back to that idea that the woman is just a vessel to grow a man's seed rather than an active partner in creating life. That the life force comes from the man and the woman is just the fertile earth type idea
Right.
from Aristotle. And so I think, you know, that's another angle of it, is that it also disempowers women from having a part in the miracle of creation.
Yeah. Oh, that's like that is part of the reason for the vagina dentata mythology is to disenfranchise women in that way. Yeah. hmm Yeah,
Well,
totally.
it,
Because because before the men come away, women don't know how to use their vagina, right?
Right.
It's this thing that just can't be used. It has no purpose. It has no, and then suddenly men take the teeth out and it becomes something that can create life. So it's through their actions that it becomes the creation vessel rather than what it is naturally.
yeah.
I want to make a comment about that in terms of what's happening in New Age spirituality. And there's this rhetoric of feminine and masculine polarity where men are the givers, the active for the givers, that's the terminology, and then women are the receivers. And that's always like stuck in my craw. And I always like point to Hindu narratives or, tantric narratives at least. But I think that feels like a reiteration of what you're saying right now. That again,
Mm-hmm.
like women are just the passive, receptive vessels, ready to receive men in whatever form they come, providers of the seed. Geez, what would we do without you? We wouldn't be able to manage ourselves.
Yeah.
So it's happening, it's still happening in spiritual circles in a new
Yeah.
way.
Yeah,
And there's a
absolutely.
fabulous article that you might be interested with your sort of Christian theology angle of things. It's by Jill Wright, and it's about she kind of juxtaposes this issue, the image of the vagina dentata, with the baptismal font.
Yeah.
Oh,
So I think you'd
wow.
find that fascinating.
You, yeah, you mentioned her in the book, right? Or
Yeah.
that article
Yeah.
in the book. Yeah. Okay.
It's interesting to me as we're talking about all of this and the separation of woman from the creative act, the idea of the great mother of the eternal womb out of which came all creation, and when we look at early Neolithic and Paleolithic, archaeological evidence and uh, it just seems to me that this whole mythology, right, is all part and parcel of the dismantling of the earlier matrilineal and matriarchal goddess worshiping early cultures, right? That were tied into the cycles of the earth, the cycles of birth, life, and death, that it was through all feminine animals, so to speak, right? That life came forth, right, before the understanding of men's part in procreation. And so it just seems to me that in the dismantling and the destruction of goddess culture, right? That these stories then are woven into the entire uh, birth, growth, and expansion of patriarchal consciousness.
And it's interesting you bring up that Neolithic era because I hadn't explored it in my book, but it's been something I've been kind of thinking about lately. Is you know when you look at that early goddess prototype, there was a lot of snake imagery invoked around her, and a lot of that came from this idea that when you look at the open mouth of a snake, it is very yonic, but it also has teeth, right? And it's that life and death cycle.
Yeah.
And I'd been thinking about that lately as to whether that's maybe where some of this idea sprung from, because that was sort of that yonic representation, but it did have those teeth. Um, and so it was, as they were dismantling these goddess ideas, whether they kind of brought forth that as that negative connotation to sort of dismantle that idea.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, of course, part of the imagery of the snake is the shedding of the skin, and so
Hmm.
that it's constantly brings itself anew through rebirth, right? Through the
Hmm.
shedding of the skin and rebirth that way. So the shedding of the old into the new. I mean, some of these questions that go back to early human antiquity, we likely will never be able to answer, but we are living in the consequences, right, of these mythological inheritances in terms of the relationships between men and women, the energy of the sexual dynamic between men and women, the current assault on women's sovereignty over their physical bodies, over their life choices. Just looking at the whole manosphere, all of the things that are going on in terms of really polar opposites, right? In terms of movement in the psyche, right? The I don't even know what phase of feminism we're in now. Are we in the eighth? Are we in the eighth,
I think we'd be in the fifth, technically, fourth or fifth.
fourth or fifth, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
I know that there were some like around the time that we were graduating. I think they were saying it was the next wave, right? Which had to do with like gender and those kinds of things. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know where the myth is going, right?
Well, that's interesting because I feel like from that perspective that what's happening is it's being ejected from the unconscious, from the underworld, from the shadows, right? It's like been high. So all of this,
Ironic image. It's being ejected.
I
Yes.
know she's expelling it now from her womb tomb, and she's like, here we are. We need to like, bring it to the surface. So like any disease, right? You have to like bring it to the surface in order to like sweat it out or heal it. So it's like we're sweating out the disease right now, and that's probably why it feels so intense because it's just in that sweating phase, and it's so sick, and it's everywhere, and it's prevalent, and we have to just keep seeing and seeing and seeing. Um,
Yeah, I
Yeah,
wonder though, I wonder, Emma, if you could just comment on this, and you may not know, or you may not know, but looking at like the whole 62 million in the website where men are giving each other tips on drugging and assaulting their wives. And these are women who are already their wives. These
Hmm.
are women who are getting up every morning and having breakfast with these men, who are living and trusting with and raising their children and building a life, and who may, as the woman in England, didn't know for years
Mm.
this was going on. So here we have essentially the toothless, right, vagina, basically part of the the ongoing life family unit,
Hmm.
and we still have the desire to kill and assault, and to basically make the woman like dead and assault.
And I think that taps into that fetish of submission, right? That is the ultimate submissive. I mean, you go back to Sleeping Beauty, right? Of that's the ultimate. You can fall in love with a woman that's basically unconscious and she's perfect. You know, an unconscious woman can't say no, right? But you don't have to ask her. Um, and you can assume that, well, it's within the confines. Like there's those layers of justification. Well, it's within the confines of my marriage. I'm entitled to this. If she's unconscious, she's not actively saying no. Like we've taught about consent to the point that maybe, this is just a loophole that they think is acceptable, which obviously it's not. But I think it goes into this fantasy of this submissive woman, like, you know, you look at the manosphere and they complain about women being too mouthy and feeling like they have rights and sovereignty over their bodies. I mean marital rape is such a new thing, right? Because before that it wasn't considered rape. It was something that you agreed to when you got married, is that you turned your body over to your husband, and so therefore you didn't have even the right to say no. Um, so I think it's a pushback on some of those ideals, but it's also, you know, I mean personally, I would not want to have sex with an unconscious man, right? That would destroy any reason for me having sex with him. So it's that difference of, is it solely about you, or is it being joined with another person, right? And so I think that is one of the problems with men, is that because they're so used to this male centric perspective of everything, that sex has become something that is solely about them.
hmm Yeah. So where do we go from here?
That's a very good question. I mean, I read comments on threads and Instagram and different places on the internet, and essays and on Substack and reflections and outrage, and you know women's outrage is building, if it can get any more outraged. And some men are joining the outrage, right? Some men are joining the outrage, and other men are taking more defensive positions. I don't know, where do we go from here. That's a very good question. That's a very good question.
And I think a lot of it comes down to just this basic idea that men don't respect women, right? You wouldn't do things like this to someone that you respected, to
Yeah.
someone that you believed was your equal. And you hear men complaining about, equality has already happened and things, but it hasn't happened. Yes, there may have been steps towards it. In some countries, yes, you may be on equal pay, not all of them, obviously, but there have been those steps towards that. But equality doesn't come until women are respected equally, and they're
Yeah.
not.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That's the baseline.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's the answer, is like coming to a place where we change the belief system, the inner belief system, so that men have an intrinsic understanding of women's inherent value. So that
Yeah.
they learn, yeah, and it's not about being better than or it's really that of women having intrinsic value.
Yeah,
Um,
the unfortunate thing is that the system that we're living under, whether you want to name it or not, is harmful to everyone.
and the planet, animals, plants, everything, water.
Yeah.
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 And it's this idea of, this submission is there's no respect tied to it, right? You want a woman that serves your needs. Her needs are not even considered. Um, you want a partner that is just there for you, that will do your bidding. But you're never going to respect someone that is just basically something that you own. Um, but I think that the piece that people are missing is that you can't have love in a relationship like that, right? You can maybe have feelings of, you know, like ownership and I love this because I own it, but not loving this idea of this is a person that excites me, that helps me grow. And that's where a lot of it comes from, right? If someone doesn't challenge you, you don't have to grow. It's just the ultimate laziness.
Yeah.
You don't have to become a better person for a woman that is completely submissive to you.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And a
and
part, I think part of the unknown or part of the difficulty that presents itself in a life is how much we change over time, right?
Mhm,
That the marriage or the relationship, whatever we want to call it, whether it's a friend with benefits, whether it's a partnership, whether it's a marriage, um, that as we grow and age through different stages, real stages of psychological development, right, in the human psyche, that our perspectives and needs and desires and goals change.
Hmm.
mhm,
So what seems to be working one year may not work the next.
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then, but I mean, you look at the incel movement and they're absolutely horrid towards women. They have absolutely no respect for women and they're angry that women won't have sex with them. And there's no acknowledgement that, perhaps their behavior is the cause of, women not wanting to be with them. It's just this anger and this entitlement of, where's my woman?
Yeah.
Whereas, if you just grew a little and manage to respect other people and have empathy, and then you probably would find a partner. But it's much easier to sit in your parents' bedroom and yell it through the computer that you're angry that your allotted woman has not arrived.
And
Yeah.
understand that they're human like you. They have desires, wants, fears, insecurities, passions. They're just like you in that respect. But I think that's, kind of back to our conversation about respect and intrinsic value is there's this objectification in a way, objectification of women as being not quite human, as obviously the second sex. Thank you, Simone de Beauvoir,
Mhm.
in which, yeah, we're all enculturated into the idea that women are men's servants.
Well,
Yeah,
this goes back to Aristotle, men are human, women are other. I mean, this is ancient, ancient, ancient embedded Western thinking.
the second
Yeah.
sex. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
And
I
it's
think,
interesting as well. I was just going to quickly say that when
yeah,
you look at the idea of the vagina, these dentata these days, like the woman has actually completely disappeared. So when you look at Alien and Predator and things, they are just the embodiment of the vagina dentata with the woman missing now, and it's just destroying that. Like the woman has disappeared completely. Like it is now just this monstrous vagina, um, and
It's
I
a
think that that's
destructive,
interesting.
all-consuming force, right?
Yeah, yeah, but the woman is gone.
Yeah.
well, thank you so much, Dr. Emma. This was great, and I really enjoyed your book, and I know Andrea did as well. And
Yeah.
so I encourage everybody to, yes, go on to Amazon or wherever else it's being sold. Um, Buy a copy, read it now. It'll fill in all the gaps that we didn't have time to get to as well. So, Dr. Emma, any last words?
I just really appreciate you guys having me on again. And, I think if there's any takeaway from this, I really think it's how important sexual education is, because this really is just one of those juvenile ideas that has just continued to manifest because it hasn't been dispelled.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And it's great as always to chat with you about all things mythology.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.